Hello, I'm Nathan Stanley, and today I'll be talking about the mitigation and prevention of denial of service attacks against 911. So, 911 is critical national infrastructure. Uh, as a service, they initiate the response to crimes that would necessitate law enforcement response, incidences that need the fire department to respond, or emergency medical services. So their availability failures risk life and property loss. And now, on the topic of the prevention of denial of service attacks against 911, that is only over these past few years just now becoming a possibility. Prior to next generation 911, which is a new standardization and a plan to redesign the infrastructure of 911 with telecom companies and how they're all interconnected. Um, Prior to this, 911 up to a few years ago still used the legacy infrastructure from when the 911 system was first created in the 1990s, where the telephone lines that came into the center to deliver 911 calls, at least in Georgia, were still copper lines. Um, so I actually used to be a 911 dispatcher. And in that facility, we had the copper lines coming into the facility. And so while you can FaceTime someone across the entire world in perfect, high definition quality, if it rained while you were dialing 911, there was static on the line. But as I was saying, as the industry starts to implement this new standardization, these new standards known as NG 911, there are new cyber attack services, mainly denial of service attacks. So it's a shift from the legacy telephony infrastructure to IP-based architecture. It uses the session initiation protocol and voice over internet protocol. It's got greater flexibility because you're able to handle those calls how you want instead of the cell tower's physical location determining where the call goes. We can, for example, use the GPS location on your phone or see the phone's language, the phone's operating system language, and then send you to a special, like statewide Spanish speaking 911 center. So the current planned architecture of NG 911 looks a little something like this. So we have the public here, either malicious user equipment or legitimate user equipment. Either which way, they'd send this side is simplified, but they'd signal to the cell tower that you're initiating an I1 call. They give you priority, and you send a SIP invite. And that gets sent to what is known as the EZINet, which is basically how all of NG 911 public safety answering points or 911 centers would be connected is through EZINet. So the SIP invite would get sent through the border control function, which is to ensure that the only data that can get into the EZINet is from service providers or telecom companies. They have to facilitate the communication between cell phones, user devices, and the EZINet. Once the packet gets into the EZINet, it gets input into the emergency service routing proxy, which will use data from the emergency call routing function location, or ECRF. It's the ECRF location data, which It's a database of cell tower locations, um, and that'll help it determine the initial location to route your call. And then in conjunction with the cell company, they talk back and forth, and they figure out, they lower the uncertainty radius for where your location is. And depending on some factors like, is your service provider a VoIP only provider that is based overseas? They can use a policy routing function here to determine some more things, like if they need to um, route you overseas or some other reason. But then after it determines which PSAP to send you to, again, through the border control function, you're still in the EZNet, but now you're on the actual network of the PSAP. And then you go straight to the call takers. And now in this scenario, if there were to be and I'll go a bit more in depth into what the types of denial of service attacks that can be done against 911. But in this scenario, there is no real way to filter out massive distributed denial of service attacks. And the industry as a whole has been reluctant to do so because these are scenarios where you want 0 false positives to block a call, right? With normal DDoS prevention, if you block someone who's trying to connect to a website because you think they're part of a DDoS attack, okay, whatever. But for 911, someone could be bleeding out on the side of the road and just so happen to dial 911, and the characteristics of that call align with a DDoS attack that's ongoing. And so you block them. And now they die. So you can't have any false positives, or at least the smallest amount of false positives possible. And so as they went to NG 911, they kept that philosophy somewhat. There is no way to prevent a denial of service attack with this architecture. So the denial of service threat landscape, there are 2 main denial of service threats. You have the telephony denial of service, TDoS, whose main goal of how that would operate within NG 911 architecture is to overwhelm human operators. Prior to NG 911, when you had physical copper lines coming in, you had, say, 12 copper lines, you could take 12 911 calls. TDoS was a lot more effective in the old architecture, where you would just have to have more than 12 ongoing calls to the 911 center and no one else could call 911. But now, as you move over to VoIP, you can have a theoretically unlimited amount of calls ongoing at once. But you're still limited by the human factor. If there's not a human to answer the 911 call, then the call goes unanswered. But then with NG 911, there's also SIP-based DDoS attacks that will exhaust network resources. So again, TDoS is going to be mass call flooding, targets the dispatchers and the call queues because they're hoping either people just disconnect or they never get an answer. And also on the dispatcher side, when they receive this flood of calls, it's hard to distinguish from real disasters. If there's something actually going on where people can't talk, or if it's just a malicious attack. With SIP invite floods, this targets the this session initiation protocol servers. It'll create half-open sessions where the user equipment will begin communicating with the server. The server will send back an acknowledgement, and then the server is waiting for the user equipment to talk back, and it never does. And so if you have enough of that going on at once, it can exhaust server state tables and server resources. So because it's not bandwidth based, it's cheaper to do than other DOS attacks. It exploits how the protocol works. It exploits the server memory and state tables, which will fill up quickly, and it'll start blocking legitimate emergency calls. And it's hard to mitigate with quality of service policies alone, wherein you can't just have how the dispatcher acts mitigate this. A lot of centers have open line policies where if you pick up a phone and it's silent, you can't just hang up. So, if it's a bot call, where we're going to make it easy for this policy as well. If it's a automated botnet attack, sending in SIP invites, which wouldn't even result in calls. But let's say they did want to exhaust the human factor, and they send in silent calls. They could have fake audio playing, but they just send silent calls. A lot of centers, their policy will require these dispatchers to stay on the line for a minute, 2 minutes before they can disconnect. So within NG911, there are some existing defenses in the standard. So there is the capability of blocking known malicious numbers. That is not practical because the legal implications of 911 blocking your number or blocking a number is massive and requires a lot of paperwork and cannot be done quickly. If the attacker doesn't even change their number and is just repeatedly calling or with a SIP flood, if they take no precautions to hide their device's identity, you cannot block that device from calling 911 without a lot of paperwork. So you cannot react in a timely manner to resume normal operations at the 911 center. So the blocking no numbers is not a good defense. You have resource prioritization, and you have the shaken identity framework, which kind of go hand in hand, those last two. The shaken identity framework is basically, it's more on the telecom side than it is the EZNet side, which would be ran by governmental agencies. The telecom companies would basically, for example, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being most trustworthy, 5 being least trustworthy, they would rate a call going to 911. And they would do this based on how much information they know about. So, for example, most trustworthy would be the telecom company knows who the owner of the device is. They know what the device is and where they're calling from. So that would basically be a scenario where you're on your cell phone, you're in network, you're not roaming, and you dial 911. That's just a normal cell phone call. Least trustworthy would be, a 5 would be, for example, an overseas scam call center. Their VoIP software trying to connect through our telecom network to the 911 center. The telecom companies don't know who's calling, don't know the device. They don't believe the number that it's presenting is real. But the shaken identity framework hasn't even ever really been tested yet because, again, they're still deploying next generation 911. So those are passive defenses. And the problem with that is that prioritization doesn't free exhausted resources if the server's already full. Legitimate calls still fail. The attackers hold the server resources. Availability will collapse. So with my research, the methodology, to study this, I built a discrete event simulation using Python's SymPy library, and it models a real next generation 911 border control under attack. And so I was able to run different types of attacks with different implementations of defenses. And there were 3 defense scenarios that I tested. The first is no defense. So that's first in, first out, as in the order at which people's now one calls were received by the PSAP is the order at which they're answered and handled. The second, resource prioritization. So that's priority queuing based on the shaken protocol. So more trust. So there is a queue. And then within that queue, there are as many sub queues as there are shaken levels. So if you're most trustworthy, you go into the front queue. And then that queue itself is sorted by FIFO, first in, first out. And then if you're ready to 2, you're one queue back, again, first in, first out. And the third was machine learning based call validation treatment that actively filters malicious traffic. So the machine learning defense looks at a couple of features. It analyzes the session initiation protocol header features. It can detect bot generated patterns, and it can do something called preemption, where it can drop malicious traffic early. So this wouldn't be on the PSAP, the actual, city level department to handle. Because you can still do a denial of service attack, even if they're trying to filter traffic, because that device itself has a limit to how many resources it can expend. So if we were to look at the machine learning implementation, the originating service provider in the public side is the same. But once you get into the core services, it changes a bit. So as it enters the border control and goes into the emergency service routing proxy, depending on if the call validation treatment is running all the time or only if depreciated service is detected, the ESRP will share with the CVT, the call validation treatment model, the data of the call. And then if it determines that the suspicion level of that call is over a certain threshold, it can forward that to the policy routing function rules, which will now have further definitions based on the features of the model. And it can then determine, this is a very suspicious call. Is this a bad actor? If it is a bad actor, it'll send it back to the ESRP. And then because we don't want any false positives, we don't want dropped calls, we can send this back through the border control function. And if the CVT otherwise determined it to be legitimate, it would just go straight back to the ESRP, who, just like in the prior model, it would communicate with the emergency call routing function, the ECRF, to determine location, to determine which PSAP to send it to. It goes out the border control. If it is determined to be a legitimate call, it can go straight to the normal queue for call takers and PSAPs. Otherwise, it can go to the mitigation queue. So as you could probably guess, there is one that won over. So no defense, 76% call loss. So that's the first in, first out. Understandably, had a lot of call loss. Resource prioritization. So that's the shaken protocol. No, not much better. 73% loss. There was some success where the most obviously malicious calls were blocked, but otherwise, due to an overabundance of caution, cannot block every other call. With the machine learning defense, there was at most a 2% loss. And that's a conservative estimate. So stark results, without an active defense, 70% of legitimate calls failed. With machine learning filtering, losses drop dramatically. So the key takeaway is that quality of service mechanisms are not security mechanisms. Active filtering is required to preserve availability of 911. And early rejection is important. So rejecting malicious calls earlier in the pipeline from user equipment to PSAP. Now, there are some challenges with implementing a machine learning based approach. There is a disparity in availability of training data. It's scarce because 911, again, not just police, more calls that go in the 911 are medical related than they are law enforcement related. So, and a lot of that data, there's personally identifiable information, and some of that data can be restricted by HIPAA. And of course, there's also real-time performance constraints. So future research could approach this issue with federated learning. So there's local training at PSAPs. It'll allow local model training without sharing the raw data, and enables collaboration across a multitude of public safety answering points while preserving the privacy. So next generation 911 introduces serious new risks. Risks that, at least on this scale, individual 911 centers have not had to face before. Passive defenses will fail, and machine learning based call validation is essential for protecting emergency services moving forward.